I want you to stop for a moment before you read a single word of what follows. I want you to think about the last time you cared for something that didn't ask for your help. Something that couldn't say thank you. Something that might have killed you if it got the chance. And you helped it anyway, not because anyone was watching, not because there was a reward, not because it made any kind of logical, reasonable sense. Now hold that feeling. Because what Callum Greer did out in the high country of the Sangre de Cristo Range in the autumn of 1887 doesn't fit inside any clean moral lesson. It doesn't wrap itself up in a bow. It doesn't end the way you want it to. And that's exactly why it stayed with me for 30-some years, carved into the inside of my chest like something a blade left behind. A mountain lion, a cowboy, 38 days, and the question nobody wanted to answer out loud. Who exactly was saving whom? Read on, but understand, you won't finish this the same person you started it. I keep a field journal, have since I was 19 years old when my uncle Amos Whitfield, a man of peculiar habits and extraordinary patience, handed me a leather-bound notebook and told me that a man who doesn't write down what he sees will forget half his life before he's 50. I've carried one ever since. This particular journal, the one I'm pulling from now, is the 8th I've filled. The cover is warped from rain. There's a bloodstain on page 43 that I will not explain yet. My name is Elias Whitfield. I am not the cowboy in this story. I am the man who watched him. That distinction matters. It matters because I want to be clear from the start that I have no heroic stake in what happened out near Trappers Creek in the fall of 1887. I was there as a surveyor's assistant for the Colorado Territorial Land Commission, mapping boundary lines between ranch claims in the high country. I was 26 years old, perpetually underpaid, and possessed of exactly zero skills that would have been useful in a genuine emergency. I could write clearly, sketch a passable topographic line, and calculate acreage without making too many errors. That was the whole of my value. Callum Greer's value was different. He was the kind of man the high country produced sometimes, lean without being fragile, quiet without being cold. He worked the Alderman Ranch, about 4 miles northeast of Trappers Creek, and he had the look of someone who had spent so many years in wind and altitude that the land had simply started writing itself onto him. Deep creases at the corners of his eyes, hands that were never quite clean. A way of moving that was unhurried without being slow, as though he had made a private arrangement with time that the rest of us weren't party to. I'd met him 3 weeks before the lion. We'd crossed paths at the supply post in Alamitos, and he'd helped me load a transit case onto my mule without being asked. He didn't introduce himself. I thanked him. He nodded once and went back to whatever he was doing. Later, Alderman's foreman told me Callum rarely spoke more than 50 words on a given day, and that most of those words were directed at livestock. Not unfriendly, the foreman said, just internal. That man does his thinking out loud in his head, not through his mouth. I wrote that down. I write everything down. The first morning I saw Callum with the lion was October 4th, 1887. I know the date precisely because I wrote it in my journal within an hour of the encounter, while my hands were still not entirely steady. It was early, just past first light. The sky that particular shade of cold blue that high country mornings have before the sun clears the ridgeline. I'd camped the previous night about a quarter mile from Trappers Creek, in a stand of ponderosa that offered some shelter from the wind. I'd woken before dawn, as I often did, on account of a recurring nightmare that I won't detail here. I'd built up the fire and was making coffee when I heard it. Not a roar, not what you'd expect from a mountain lion. It was smaller than that, a wet, labored sound, something between a cough and a moan, rhythmic in its misery. It came from down toward the creek, maybe 100 yards through the trees. I sat very still. My first thought, I'll admit, was self-preservation. Mountain lions don't generally advertise themselves. If one was making that kind of noise, something was wrong with it, and a wounded predator is not an invitation to investigate. I am not a man given to impulsive bravery. I sat with my coffee cup halfway to my lips for a full 2 minutes, listening, doing nothing. Then I heard a second sound. A human voice. Low, steady, talking in the quiet monotone that experienced horsemen sometimes use with a spooked animal. Not really words so much as sound. A kind of verbal presence that says I'm here, I'm not threatening, I'm just here. It was coming from the same direction as the lion's coughing. That's what got me moving. Curiosity has always been a weakness of mine. My Uncle Amos called it a gift. My mother called it the thing that would get me killed. I haven't settled the argument yet. I took my journal habit and moved toward the creek. What I found in the gray-blue morning light at the bank of Trapper's Creek will take me some effort to describe accurately, because my first impression was so strongly at odds with everything I understood to be possible in the natural world. Callum Greer was crouched at the water's edge, 3 feet from a mountain lion. The lion was lying on its side in the shallow gravel, partially in the water, partially out. It was a large animal. I would later learn it was a male, probably 5 to 6 years old, and under different circumstances it would have been genuinely terrifying in its physical presence. Even now, even broken and still, it had the quality of compressed power that large predators carry, a sense of potential violence held in suspension. But it was in terrible shape. Its right rear leg was caught, or had been caught, in what I could see was a rusted leg trap, the jaws of which had been sprung but not removed. The trap had done its work. The leg below the knee joint was destroyed, swollen to grotesque proportions, the fur matted with old blood and newer discharge, the whole thing carrying that particular Swedish rot smell that I associated from a field surgery I'd once observed with deep tissue damage. The lion had been dragging that leg. There were marks in the gravel and mud where it had pulled itself to the creek. How long it had been lying there I couldn't say. Hours, certainly, maybe longer. And Callum Greer was crouched 3 feet from it, talking in that low, steady voice, and the lion, this injured, terrified predator with every biological reason to lunge at the nearest warm body, was watching him with enormous amber eyes that were wet with exhaustion, and I thought, something that I don't have a clinical word for. Something that was not quite trust. Something earlier than trust. Recognition, maybe, the acknowledgement of another presence, the preliminary to something. I froze at the tree line. I did not move. I did not breathe loudly. Callum did not look at me. I don't think he knew I was there. He was entirely focused on the lion, and that focus had a quality of completeness to it that I found almost more striking than the scene itself, as though the rest of the world had simply ceased to register for him. Just the man and the lion and the sound of the creek and the slow lightening of the sky. He was talking. I could hear the cadence of it, the rhythm, though I couldn't make out words at that distance. After a long moment he moved very slowly, inches at a time, and held out his hand, palm down, toward the lion's face. His hand was trembling slightly. That detail matters. He wasn't calm. He was scared, and he was doing it anyway, which is not the same thing at all as being calm. The lion inhaled through its nose, looked at his hand, looked at his face. Made that wet, labored sound again, not aggression, not warning, something else. Then it put its head back down on the gravel. Callum stayed exactly where he was for another 10 minutes. Then he backed away slowly, stood and turned, and saw me standing at the tree line. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You got rope. Strong rope, not just line." "I have line," I said. My voice was not quite steady. "That'll do," he said. "Go get it." I've thought many times about what would have happened if I'd said no. If I'd pointed out, reasonably, accurately, that what he was proposing was insane, that you don't nurse a wounded mountain lion, that the animal would die of its injuries or of stress, or that it would recover enough to kill him before it was well enough to run. I thought all of those things. I thought them clearly and in sequence. And then I went and got the line. I don't have a good explanation for that. I've written several attempts in this journal in subsequent entries, and they all ring false. The honest answer is that I watched Callum Greer back away from a mountain lion in the half-dark at Trapper's Creek, and there was something in his posture, in the way he moved, the complete absence of theatrical bravery in it, the sheer practicality, that made it seem like the only sensible thing to do was help him. When I came back with the line, he'd already returned to the lion's side. "It's the trap," he said without preamble. "Leg's bad, but the trap's still pinching the bone. If we get it off, the leg might drain right, might not." "Might not," I repeated. "Yeah. And if we try to remove the trap, it might." "Yeah," he said again. He didn't need me to finish. He looked at me. He had gray eyes, lighter than I'd expected up close. "You don't have to stay," he said. "Go back to camp. I won't think less of you." The thing is, he meant it. There was no manipulation in it, no subtle invitation to prove myself. He genuinely meant that I could leave, and he would not judge me for it, and he would proceed alone. That honesty, that complete absence of social coercion, was the thing that made me stay more than anything else. Tell me what you need, I said. What followed was 2 hours of the most frightening and strangely methodical work I've ever participated in. Callum's plan was simple in theory, brutal in execution. We needed to restrain the lion well enough to remove the trap without it turning on either of us, and we needed to do this without further injuring the leg, and we needed to do this without triggering the kind of panic response that would kill the animal through shock before we got the trap off. Simple in theory. In practice, it required us to move close enough to a mountain lion that I could smell its breath, which was hot and rank and deeply animal, and which I will not forget until I die. He talked to it the entire time. That continuous, low, cadenced murmur, the words blending into each other until they were just sound, just presence. I found myself doing it too, after a while, though my version was considerably less composed. I was mostly narrating what I was doing in hushed terms, like a man explaining a process to himself, which perhaps I was. The lion allowed us to approach. I don't know why. I've read since that severely injured animals sometimes enter a kind of shock-adjacent state in which their normal threat responses are suppressed. I've also read that this is not reliably true, and that plenty of injured mountain lions have killed people who thought they were in that state. So I cannot tell you with certainty why this particular lion, on this particular morning, allowed 2 men to crouch over it and work a trap free of its ruined leg. Maybe it was exhausted past fighting. Maybe it understood something on some level I can't access. Maybe Callum's voice carried something that registered in the animal's nervous system as non-threat. I don't know. I write down what I see, not what I can explain. It took us 40 minutes to free the trap. The leg, when the metal came off, was worse than I'd prepared myself for. Callum looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he took a slow breath through his nose and let it out. "Okay," he said, not to me. Mostly, I think, to himself. "Is it?" I started. "Don't know yet." He began cleaning the wound with water from the creek, using a strip cut from his own bandana, moving with the slow care of someone performing a ritual rather than a field surgery. The lion flinched, made that sound. Callum kept talking, kept working, never hurrying, never stopping. I sat back on my heels in the gravel and watched him and wrote later in my journal. He talks to the lion the way some men pray, not asking for anything, just maintaining contact with something larger than himself. I'm not sure that's right, but I'm not sure it's wrong either. We moved the lion that afternoon. This was Callum's decision, and I'll admit I didn't argue as strenuously as I should have. He'd ridden back to the Alderman Ranch at mid-morning, borrowed a flatbed pull cart used for hauling fence posts, and returned by noon. The logic, as he explained it in his minimal fashion, was that the lion couldn't stay at the creek. The water was good, but the exposure was bad, and predators would smell the wound. "Wolves?" I asked. "Among other things." Moving the lion required us to get close again. The animal had improved marginally in the morning hours. It had lapped water from the creek once, which Callum took as a significant sign, though he didn't editorialize on this. Its amber eyes tracked us as we approached with the cart. Its tail moved once, a slow, heavy sweep, like a pendulum winding down. We built a kind of sling from rope and saddle blankets and moved the lion onto the cart. It did not fight us. I cannot explain this. It simply watched and breathed and allowed itself to be moved, and the only sound it made throughout the entire process was one long, low exhalation as we settled it onto the blankets, which I wrote down as a sigh and then crossed out and rewrote as something like acceptance. Callum moved it to an old stone-walled pen at the back of the Alderman property. Used for quarantining sick cattle, Alderman told me later, with visible displeasure, and that was where the 38 days began. I should account for my own presence in this story, because it requires some explanation. I had work to do. I had surveys to complete, boundary lines to record, obligations to the Territorial Land Commission that did not include spending the better part of a month watching a cowboy nurse a mountain lion. My assigned partner, a man named Gruber, had taken ill and returned to Alamitos 10 days prior. I was working alone. I could have continued alone. I could have moved on. I didn't. Part of it was the journal. My Uncle Amos, who was a tiresome philosopher, used to say that a man is obligated to stay with the true things when he finds them, because true things are rare and you cannot manufacture them at will. I'd thought that was self-serving nonsense when he said it. I was beginning to think he might have had a point. Part of it was Callum himself. He never asked me to stay. He never suggested it would be useful. He simply proceeded with what he was doing, and I found that I kept drifting back to the stone pen at the end of each day, sitting on the fence rail with my journal, watching, writing. By the third day, Callum acknowledged my presence by handing me a mug of coffee when I arrived in the morning. By the fifth day, I was helping him with the feeding. By the 10th day, I think we both understood that I wasn't leaving until this was over, whatever over meant, and neither of us spoke about it directly because some agreements don't require language. The first week was the worst. I want to be precise about that. The lion, Callum, started calling him Cobre on the second day, for the copper-brown color of his coat in the afternoon light, and the name stuck without ceremony, was deeply, genuinely close to death. The leg wound had developed infection that Callum treated with poultices made from pine tar and plantain leaves in a recipe he said he'd learned from an Apache woman named Lupe who had worked as a healer for a ranch crew near Cimarron some years before. He said this without particular elaboration, in the same tone he used for most things, and I didn't press him on it. Whether the recipe was effective, or whether Cobre simply had a constitution strong enough to fight through what his body had suffered, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that by the 4th day the discharge from the wound had changed in character, still present, still alarming but different, cleaner smelling, and by the 6th day Cobre had eaten for the first time. That first eating was significant enough that I devoted 3 full pages of my journal to it. Callum had shot a rabbit at dawn, dressed it, and left it at the near end of the pen. Then he'd withdrawn to the fence and we'd waited. For 2 hours nothing happened. Cobre lay in the far corner and looked at the rabbit with the flat, disinterested gaze of an animal that has not yet reestablished its relationship with wanting things. Then at mid-morning something shifted. His nostrils moved. His head came up a half-inch, the tail swept once. He ate the rabbit in 4 minutes and then lay back down with the deliberateness of a king retiring to his chambers. And Callum stood at the fence with his hands in his pockets and didn't say anything for a long time, and his jaw worked slightly like he was chewing on words he'd decided not to release. And I wrote, "He looks like a man who has just seen a promise kept that he'd believed was broken." I think that's close. Alderman himself was another element of those early days. Jeb Alderman was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, and his practicality expressed itself in a deep and genuine impatience with the whole enterprise. He allowed Callum the use of the stone pen. He did not forbid the project. But he made his feelings known in the way that men of his type make their feelings known, not through confrontation but through presence, standing at the pen fence at irregular intervals with his thumbs in his belt, looking at Cobre with the expression of a man calculating a balance that keeps coming up short. "Thing's going to die anyway," he said to me one evening the second week. Callum was inside the pen working on the leg, "or it won't die and it'll kill him." "He seems to know what he's doing," I said. "Don't doubt it." Alderman watched for a moment. "Callum always knows what he's doing. That's not the question. The question is whether what he's doing makes any kind of sense." He spat into the dust. "Mountain lion isn't a horse, it isn't a dog. You don't nurse it back and then it's grateful. You nurse it back and then it's a mountain lion again, and mountain lions eat cattle." He said my cattle with his eyes, not his mouth, and then walked away. I wrote his words down as I wrote everything down, and I thought about them at night when I couldn't sleep, which was often, because he wasn't wrong. Alderman was a man whose wrongness was limited and specific. He was wrong about the things that require you to act outside of sense, and he was right about almost everything else. The question was whether those were the things that mattered. By the end of the first week, I had established a daily rhythm that I've since come to think of as one of the more peculiar periods of my adult life. I would rise before dawn, make fire and coffee, carry a second mug to the pen, and sit on the fence rail while Callum did his morning work with Cobre. The work varied: wound care, feeding, simply sitting in the pen with the lion in the quiet morning way that Callum seemed to believe was itself a form of medicine. He didn't explain his methodology to me. I observed it. Cobre had begun to accept Callum's presence in the pen with something approaching ease. Not comfort, exactly. His ears were always moving, tracking sounds, and his eyes followed every movement with the trained attention of a predator. But the tension had gone out of him in a particular way when Callum was present. His breathing was different. His tail was still. He tracked Callum with his eyes, the way a cat tracks a person they have decided is acceptable. I noted this in my journal. I also noted that Callum seemed aware of these small signals in a way that required no conscious processing. He adjusted his movements, his pace, his proximity in continuous response to Cobre's body language, the way a good horseman adjusts to a horse. It was fluent. It was almost beautiful in the functional, non-decorative way that skilled things are beautiful. There was one morning, the 9th day, that I come back to often. Callum was sitting cross-legged in the far corner of the pen, in the sun, not doing anything in particular, not working on the wound, not feeding, just sitting. Cobre was 3 feet away, lying on his side, the bad leg extended. They were both very still, and the sun was on them both, and the pen smelled of pine tar and animal and morning, and I sat on the fence with my journal open and found I couldn't write. I just watched. After perhaps 20 minutes, Cobre lifted his head and looked at Callum directly, the way the lion had not done in any of the sessions I'd observed. Not the alert, tracking gaze of threat assessment, but something steadier, something longer. Callum met the gaze and held it, and I could see the slight rise and fall of his chest, slow and deliberate, and Cobre's chest moving in the same rhythm, though I couldn't say which one had started it. Then Cobre put his head back down. Callum reached up slowly and touched the side of his own face with his fingertips, a gesture I'd seen him make before, always when something had moved him, and looked at nothing for a moment. I closed my journal. Some things you shouldn't reduce to notes. The first time Cobre stood was the 12th day. It happened in the afternoon without warning. Callum and I were at the fence, not inside the pen. Cobre simply gathered himself. There was a long, visible effort, a trembling in the shoulders, a series of small adjustments, and rose onto 3 legs, holding the injured rear limb slightly off the ground, and stood. He stood for perhaps 30 seconds. He was breathing hard. His head was slightly lowered, his tail low. Then he lowered himself back down, carefully, and lay still. Callum was quiet for a long moment after. "How bad is it?" I asked, meaning the leg, meaning the prognosis, meaning everything. "Don't know," he said, then he stood. He said it in a tone I can only describe as careful, as though the fact of it was still fragile enough to break if he held it wrong. I wrote it down, and then I wrote underneath it. The man is not doing this because he thinks it will work. He is doing this because the question of whether it will work is not, for him, the point. Later, rereading that entry, I amended it. Or perhaps he simply isn't the kind of man who knows how to leave a living thing to die when his hands are capable of being useful. I still don't know which interpretation is correct. Maybe they're the same. The night of the 14th day, I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. A low, resonant sound, not quite like anything I could place. I lay in my bedroll listening, heart moving at a different rhythm than it had been when I was asleep. Then I placed it. It was Cobre, something between a purr and a moan, not the distressed sound of the first morning at the creek. Something different. Voluntary almost. Something he was doing not in response to pain, but to I don't know. I have no scientific basis for what I'm about to write, and I wrote it in my journal with the notation personal impression, likely inaccurate, but here it is. It sounded like the lion was talking. Not to anyone, not to Callum who was asleep in the bunkhouse, just talking, making sound into the dark. The way some animals do, I know, for physiological reasons related to respiration and neural function. The way some people do, I also know, when the dark is large and the self is small, and the act of making sound is a way of insisting on your own presence. I lay in my bedroll and listened to the mountain lion make sound into the Colorado dark, and I thought about 38 days, and about the space between dying and not dying, and about what it costs to occupy that space. Then I went back to sleep. By the end of the first 2 weeks, Cobre was eating reliably, standing daily, and had begun to put partial weight on the injured leg. The infection was clearing. The swelling was reducing, though the leg would never be fully what it had been. Callum told me this without inflection. "He'll favor it," he said. "Rest of his life, probably." "But he'll live," I said. Callum considered this. "Looks that way," he said. He did not look triumphant. He did not look relieved, exactly. He looked like a man crossing something off a mental list, not the last item, not the important one, but a significant one. He looked like a man adjusting to a new version of a problem. "What happens then," I asked, "when he's well enough?" Callum didn't answer immediately. He looked at Cobre, who was moving along the far wall of the pen with his slow, 3-legged caution. testing the bad leg's weight in increments. "We'll see," he said finally. I knew at that moment that he didn't have an answer, that he had gotten so deep into the immediate problem, the wound, the infection, the eating, the standing, that the next problem, the large and probably unsolvable one, was still waiting where he'd left it, and that he was content to let it wait for now. Some men can do that, hold the present problem and let the future one wait. I've never been able to do it myself. I admire it enormously. I wrote in my journal that night, day 14. Cobre walked the length of the pen. Callum watched him and said nothing. I think they have both decided not to talk about what comes after. I think that's probably the correct decision. I'm not sure I'm capable of it, but it looks like the right thing from here. And then I closed the journal and looked at the fire for a while, which is something I don't usually allow myself to do. There is a particular quality to the third week of a thing that has no guaranteed outcome. I noticed it first in the silences. Callum's silences had always been substantial. The man used quiet the way other men used furniture, comfortably and without apology. But by the third week they had changed in character. They were heavier, more considered. He would stand at the pen fence for long minutes before entering, or sit on the fence rail after finishing Cobre's care with his hands loose in his lap, looking at nothing I could identify, his jaw working that slow private chew. I recognized it because I do the same thing myself when I'm writing through a problem. You reach a point where the problem has outgrown the frame you originally put around it, and the thinking becomes less linear. It branches, it doubles back, it sits with you at meals and follows you into sleep. The thing he was thinking around, I believed, was this: Cobre was going to live. And Cobre being alive was going to require a decision that no amount of field surgery or pine tar poultice or careful feeding could make for him. I didn't raise it. I made coffee and took notes and stayed out of it. The 15th day, a complication arrived that neither of us had anticipated. Her name was Tessie Alderman, Jeb's daughter, and she was 11 years old and possessed of the specific, unapologetic curiosity that belongs exclusively to children and certain varieties of scientists. She had apparently been aware of the mountain lion in the stone pen since approximately the second day. She told me this with the casual confidence of someone who considers eavesdropping a neutral activity, and had been conducting her own observations from a vantage point on the hay barn roof that gave her a partial view of the pen's interior. She presented herself at the pen fence one morning while Callum was inside, doing wound care. She had braids and a smear of something red, jam, I hoped, on her left sleeve, and she regarded Cobre with the calm interest of a person viewing a painting in a gallery. "Is his leg going to come back right?" she asked. Callum, inside the pen, did not react to her sudden presence with anything stronger than a mild reorientation of attention. "Probably not," he said. "But he'll walk on it. Some already is some." Tessie nodded, assessing this information. "My father says you're wasting time." "I know it. He said that even if the lion lives, you'll have to let it go, and it'll come back and eat the cattle, and then he'll shoot it." Callum was quiet for a moment. He was cleaning the wound with his characteristic slow attention. "Your father usually says what he thinks," he said. This was not a criticism or a defense. It was simply a factual observation. Tessie leaned on the top fence rail and propped her chin on her folded hands. "Are you going to let him go?" she asked. "When he's better." Callum looked at Cobre. Cobre was watching Tessie with his enormous amber eyes, his ears half forward, alert but not alarmed. "Have to," Callum said. "Even if he comes back and gets shot." "Even then?" Tessie considered this. "That seems like it might break your heart," she said, with the terrible directness of 11-year-olds discussing things that adults flinch from. Callum didn't answer immediately. He finished with the wound, sat back on his heels, and looked at the girl. "Could be," he said, "but keeping him in here would break his." I wrote that exchange down word for word while it was happening, which felt mildly intrusive. I've never been able to decide whether journalism and emotional decency are compatible. I do it anyway. Tessie stayed for most of that morning. She turned out to have a natural and completely instinctive grasp of what Callum did around the lion, quiet, steady, unhurried, and Cobre seemed no more unsettled by her presence than by mine, which was to say mildly tolerant. She asked Callum questions in a steady stream, the questions a child asks when they are genuinely and wholly interested in something. How did he know what poultice to use? Had he done this before with an animal? Did he think the lion knew he was being helped? On that last one, Callum was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. I don't know what he knows, he said finally. I know what he does. What does he do? Callum looked at Cobre, who had settled into his side-lying rest, the bad leg extended, the tail slow. He doesn't leave, Callum said. First couple days he could have dragged himself off and died somewhere else. He stayed. Tessie absorbed this. Maybe he was too hurt to go. Maybe, Callum said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Tessie, being 11 and already smarter than most adults I knew, nodded once and moved on to her next question. The 18th day brought the first genuine setback. I want to be clear. The first 2 weeks had not been smooth. They had been a continuous negotiation between what Cobre's body could sustain and what Callum's care could provide, full of small regressions and small advances, and the grinding uncertainty that is the actual texture of recovery, as opposed to the sanitized version we tell ourselves about it afterward. But nothing had broken the general forward direction. The 18th day broke it. Callum found Cobre that morning in the far corner, breathing fast and shallow, the bad leg swollen again in a way that was different from before, higher up, closer to the joint. He didn't say anything when he came out of the pen. He stood at the fence and was very still in the particular way that meant he was managing something internal. It's moved up, I asked. Looks like. What does that mean? He took a slow breath. Means I did something wrong, or the wound went deeper than I got to, or he walked on it too much yesterday. He paused. Or all three. Can you? Don't know yet. He went back in. He spent 4 hours in the pen that day, more than any previous session. He barely spoke. He worked with the same careful deliberateness as always, but there was something underneath it that was new, a tightness in his shoulders, a jaw set slightly harder than usual. He looked like a man doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. I sat on the fence rail and kept notes and felt, for the first time, genuinely afraid. Not for myself. Afraid that the thing Callum had invested 17 days of himself in was going to slip away anyway, and that there was nothing to be done about it, and that the doing of everything possible is not the same as the thing being possible. That's a lesson I've known in the abstract. I prefer it that way. Late that afternoon, Callum emerged from the pen and sat on the fence rail beside me. He didn't look at me. He looked at the mountains to the west, where the light was going gold red and the first cold of evening was coming down off the high slopes. Tell me something, he said. He almost never initiated conversation. I understood it as a request. What do you want to know? You travel a lot, you see a lot of things and write them down. He picked at a splinter on the fence rail. Do most things turn out the way they should? I thought about this seriously. He deserved a serious answer. No, I said. Most things turn out the way they do. Whether that's the way they should, I don't know who decides. He was quiet. I think, I started, then stopped, because I wasn't sure what I thought exactly. I think the turning out isn't the point. I think the working toward it is the point. But I don't know if that's actually true, or if it's just what I tell myself so I can keep getting up. Callum looked at his hands. There was dried blood on them, Cobre's blood from the afternoon's work. Yeah, he said, about what I figured. He got up and went to wash his hands at the pump. I wrote day 18. The infection has spread. I don't know if Cobre will survive the next few days. I don't know if Callum will survive it either in the ways that matter. He asked me tonight if things turn out the way they should. I didn't know what to tell him, and I told him so. I think that was the right answer. I don't think it helped. The 19th, 20th, 21st days were what I have, in subsequent years, called the interior days. The days when the story was happening entirely inside the stone pen and inside Callum Greer, with no visible external drama to record. Cobre ran fever. You can see a fever in a lion the way you see it in any large animal, the stillness that is different from rest, the lack of focus in the eyes, the occasional shudder across the flanks. He stopped eating. His breathing became the labored, measured thing it had been in the very first days at the creek. Callum did not panic. This is the thing I need you to understand, and it requires some deliberate attention because panic, in retrospect, would have been completely reasonable. An 11-year-old girl had told him he was wasting his time, and he'd said maybe. A pragmatic rancher had told him the animal would die or turn lethal, and he'd said probably true. A surveyor who kept field journals had told him that things don't turn out the way they should, and he'd said about what I figured. By every measure available to a reasonable person, Callum Greer had permission, had good cause, to look at the feverish lion and say I tried and walk away. He didn't walk away. He didn't talk about it. He didn't explain himself to me or to Alderman or to Tessie or to anyone. He just kept going into the pen every morning and doing the work, with the methodical attention of a man who has decided that the decision is already made, and there is no point in revisiting it. I have tried in the years since to articulate what that looked like from the fence rail. The best I've come to is this. It looked like stubbornness, but it wasn't stubbornness, because stubbornness implies some emotional heat, some ongoing friction against the thing resisting you. This was quieter, more like commitment. The way a river is committed to downhill, not because it chooses every moment to go downhill, but because it's the nature of the river and the question of stopping doesn't arise. I think Callum Greer was built that way. Some people are. The 22nd day was when Tessie brought the rabbit. She appeared at the pen fence in the late morning, holding a small tan rabbit in both hands, the rabbit enduring this with the stoic resignation that rabbits bring to all indignities. She held it up in Callum's direction. "He should eat a live one," she said. "My father says sick animals sometimes won't eat unless." "I know," Callum said. "I trapped it this morning." He looked at the rabbit, he looked at Tessie. "You know what I'd have to do," he said. "I know what you'd have to do," she said, with the equanimity of a child who has grown up on a working ranch and is untroubled by its essential economics. There was a pause. Callum took the rabbit. Tessie clasped her now empty hands in front of her and watched with the attentive calm of a surgical observer. I won't detail what happened next, except to say that Cobre ate. Not with the disinterest of his early recovery, not with the mechanical need of an animal eating because it has decided to survive. He ate with something closer to instinct, clean and absolute and urgent. And when he was done, he lay back with his eyes half closed, and his flank rising and falling with more steadiness than I'd seen in 3 days. Tessie watched from the fence. When it was over, she said, "Good," nodded once, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before. I looked at Callum. He was watching Cobre with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not triumph. Not relief exactly. Something softer than either and more complicated. Something that looked, from where I was sitting, like the expression a person makes when they've been carrying something very heavy for a long time and they've just taken their first step without it. He caught me looking and turned back to the lion. "Write that down," he said. "Already did," I said. The fever broke on the 23rd day. Not dramatically. Not in the middle of the night with a crisis and a resolution. It simply eased. By morning it was lower, and by afternoon Cobre's eyes had their focus back, and he stood of his own volition without the trembling effort it had required for days, and he stood for longer. Callum checked the leg. "Draining better," he said. "What does that mean?" "Means the body's working." I let that sit. "Will it heal properly now?" "Heal as proper as it's going to." He pressed along the leg with gentle fingers, watching Cobre's face for reaction. The lion watched him back, ears forward, tolerating it. "He'll have a roll in his walk," Callum said. "Rear right quarter will always be lower." "But he'll run." "You're sure?" He gave me a look that was not unkind but was definitive. "Not sure of much," he said. "Sure enough." I wrote day 23. The fever has broken. Cobre will live. Callum says he'll run, though not the way he used to run. Something has changed in the pen today. I don't mean in the lion. I mean between the man and the lion, and between the man and whatever internal account he keeps of what things cost and what they're worth. I can see it in the way he moves in there now. Not lighter, exactly. Different. Like a man who has paid a price and is now assessing what he got for it, and finding the accounting, if not exactly satisfying, at least honest. The days that followed the fever's breaking were different in texture from what had come before. The crisis had passed, and the new problem, the one Callum had been putting off engaging with, was becoming unavoidable. It was present in every session, in the way Cobre moved along the pen wall with increasing ease, in the way he began eating with a healthy animal's focused appetite rather than a sick one's reluctant necessity, in the way he began to fill the small stone pen differently, not with illness but with lionness, the sense of compressed, patient power that had been absent from him since the creek. He was recovering into himself, which meant that the decision about what happened next was getting closer. Alderman raised it directly on the 25th day. He came to the pen in the late afternoon, stood at the fence, watched Cobre pace the near wall, and turned to Callum. "About 2 weeks," Alderman said. Callum looked at him. "Maybe 3," Alderman amended. "Before he's mobile enough that the pen won't hold him, that leg won't stop him from going over a 6-foot fence." He paused. So, Callum said. "You've done a thing here," Alderman said. He said it with the particular tone of a man who has spent a month being privately certain that something was foolish and is reckoning without enthusiasm with the possibility that it wasn't. "I'm not saying you haven't done a thing. You've done a thing." "But," Callum said, "but it's my cattle." There it was, the real geometry of it, which had been true since the beginning and which no amount of pine tar or daily coffee or Tessie's rabbit had changed. Cobre was recovering. Cobre would be a mountain lion again. Mountain lions eat cattle. This was not malice or injustice. It was simply the way the land was organized, and Alderman's cattle were part of that organization, and Alderman was a man who had built his life on them. Callum didn't argue. He nodded once slowly. "Thought about the upper country," he said. "Past the Cimarron drainage, dear up there, he'd make it." "Maybe," Alderman said, "and maybe he comes back down." "Maybe." They looked at each other. The negotiation was happening in the silence, in the mutual recognition of what each man knew and what each man wanted and the space between those things. I sat on the fence rail and kept my pen still and tried to be invisible. "You could shoot him now," Callum said. "Well, he's tame enough." "I know I could." "That's your right." "I know that too." Alderman watched Cobre, who had stopped pacing and was sitting in the afternoon sun with his eyes half closed, tail curling around his feet. For a moment he looked less like a predator and more like an enormous house cat, and the incongruity of it was almost comic, and none of us laughed. "But I'm not going to," Alderman said. He said it like a man who has just surprised himself. He pushed off the fence and walked back toward the ranch house without another word. Callum watched him go. Then he looked at Cobre, then he looked at his hands. "Okay," he said, "not to me, not to the lion, to the air maybe, to whatever kept score." The question of what comes after occupied the next several days in the way that large, unresolved things occupy the space you've been using for smaller ones. Callum worked. I took notes. Tessie visited in the mornings before her chores and asked questions, and reported on her father's moods with the detached accuracy of a field correspondent. Cobre continued to recover. And somewhere in that stretch, I can't put a precise date on it, something changed between Callum and the lion. I've written about the morning of the 9th day, when they sat in the sun and their breathing matched, and I couldn't write it down. What happened in the last week of Cobre's convalescence was different. It was less still, more restless. Cobre was restoring, which meant he was increasingly active, increasingly territorial in his use of the pen space, increasingly interested in what was beyond the fence. He marked the walls. He paced. He tested the fence with his good shoulder, not seriously, not with escape intent, but with the beginning of it. And Callum began pulling back. Not abruptly, not in a way that was dramatic or that I could write about in real time. It was gradual, like a tide reversing. He shortened sessions. He moved through the wound care and the feeding efficiently and completely, but he stopped sitting in the pen afterward. He stopped the long, quiet, companionable silences in the lion's space. I noticed it on the 27th day and thought it was my imagination. By the 29th day, I was certain. "You're giving him room," I said one morning. Callum was leaning on the fence, watching Cobre move. "Have to," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because if I don't, he'll forget what he is." He picked at the fence rail. "Can't let that happen." I thought about this. Does it matter? If he's in the pen, does it matter if he... He's not staying in the pen. "Right," I said. We stood for a moment in the easy silence that 3 weeks together produces in some people. "It must be," I started, then stopped. "Don't," Callum said, not sharply, just indicating a line. I didn't. I wrote in my journal that night. He is putting distance between himself and the lion on purpose, and the purpose is the lion's good, not his own comfort. I don't know many people who can do that. put distance between themselves and something they've come to care about because the caring requires it. Most people call that kind of caring love, and most people would rather hold on. Callum is holding on by letting go. I don't have a better way to say it. The 29th day also brought unexpected visitors. Two Apache men who rode onto the alderman property in the early afternoon on horses, so fine they made alderman's stock look provisional. They spoke to Callum in a mixture of Spanish and Apache, of which I understood almost nothing, and Callum responded. His Spanish was functional, not fluent, and there was a long conversation at the pen fence during which Cobre watched all of it from the center of the pen with magnificent indifference. After the Apache men rode out, Callum came back to where I was sitting. "You know them?" I asked. "Know of them, word travels in the high country." He glanced at where they'd ridden. "They wanted to see the lion." "Why?" He shrugged in the minimal way he had that communicated. "Not I don't know, but it's more complicated than a quick answer covers. Mountain lion is significant for some of them, not sacred exactly, but significant." He paused. "One of them said the lion chose to stay at the creek, said that means something." "What does it mean?" He looked at Cobre. "He didn't explain it in a way I could follow completely," he said. "But the general feeling was that I was obligated to finish what I started." "You didn't need anyone to tell you that," I said. "No," he agreed. "But it was good to hear it anyway." He said this with an honesty so simple and unguarded that it caught me slightly off balance. In 30-some days, it was one of the most naked things he'd said. He had needed to hear it. He needed something external to confirm the thing he'd already decided, not because the decision was in doubt, but because the cost of it, maintained over days and weeks, requires periodic affirmation that the math is right. We all need that. Some of us are honest enough to admit it. I added the Apache men to my notes. I would not have left them out regardless, but there was something about their presence that completed something in the picture. The high country as a place where things were understood differently, where a man nursing a mountain lion was not eccentric but obligated, not sentimental but correct, and where the animals and the people and the land were parts of a single accounting that I, with my transit cases and my survey lines, was only beginning to partially understand. The night of the 31st day, I wrote for 3 hours straight without stopping. This was unusual. I am a methodical note-taker, not a writer by temperament. I describe, I catalog, I record. I don't usually let the words run. But something was loosening in me, approaching the end of this thing, and I wrote without editing and without stopping. And what came out was less observation and more feeling, which is not what I generally trust myself to produce. I wrote about my Uncle Amos and his leather notebook and the word obligated, and how I'd thought it was abstract all these years, and was starting to think it wasn't abstract at all. I wrote about Cobre at the creek in the blue morning, the first sound, the amber eyes. I wrote about Callum's trembling hand and what it meant that he'd been scared and done it anyway. I wrote about Tessie holding the rabbit with the calm practicality of childhood, and about Alderman saying I'm not going to, with the surprise of a man meeting a better version of himself. I wrote about the Apache men who arrived and affirmed a thing that needed affirming, and I wrote about the breathing matching in the morning sun on the 9th day. I wrote, I came here to survey boundary lines. I came here to mark the edges of things, to determine where one piece of land ends and another begins. I have been doing that work. But this other work, this thing I've been watching for 31 days at the stone pen near Trapper's Creek, this has no boundary lines. I can't survey it. I can't put it in a file for the Land Commission. What I can do is write it down and try to tell it true, and trust that someone who reads it will understand what it cost and what it was worth, and the difference between those two things. The 35th day was the last day Callum entered the pen. I don't mean the last day he did wound care. The wound had been largely closed for a week by then. The infection resolved. The leg as healed as it was going to be. I mean the last day he went inside the stone walls and occupied the same space as Cobre in the close, particular way they'd been occupying that space for 5 weeks. I think he planned it. I think he knew it was the last time going in. It was a morning session early, the light still gray and cold. He went in without the usual kit, no poultice, no water, no feeding, just him. He crossed to the center of the pen, which was where he always sat in the morning, and sat cross-legged in the pale light, and Cobre came to him. That was the part I hadn't seen before. The coming. For 34 days, Callum had always been the one who moved toward the lion. He'd been the one closing distance, approaching carefully, maintaining the specific geometry of non-threat. On the 35th day, Cobre crossed the pen and came to where Callum was sitting and lowered himself to the ground 6 inches from Callum's knee. Callum put his hand on the lion's neck. Not quickly, not tentatively, just put it there, palm flat, fingers spread, the way you'd lay your hand on the neck of a horse you've known for years. A touch that has memory in it. A touch that is also, in some sense, a goodbye that doesn't announce itself as a goodbye. Cobre made that sound, the one I'd heard in the dark on the 14th night, the one I'd described as talking. It was quieter this time, shorter, less alone in it. Callum stayed for 20 minutes. He didn't talk, as far as I could tell from the fence. He'd given up the talking voice some time in the last week, as he'd given up the long sessions, as part of the deliberate withdrawal that I understood now was the last act of care he could give the lion. He sat with his hand on the lion's neck, and I imagine he did the same thing he'd done in everything else. Was present, completely, without reservation, without the self-protective editing most of us do when we know something is ending. Then he took his hand away. He stood, he walked to the pen gate, let himself out, latched it behind him. He came to where I was on the fence rail and stood beside me. We both looked at Cobre, who had raised his head and was watching Callum with those amber eyes. His tail swept the ground once. "Tomorrow?" I asked. "Day after, probably," Callum said. He meant the release. He discussed it with Alderman, a plan to bring Cobre in the cart to the base of the high country, past the Cimarron drainage, and open the gate. He'd spent 3 evenings working out the details with the same practical thoroughness he brought to everything. "You're not going to," I started. "No," he said. He knew what I was going to ask, whether he'd try to follow to track to see what happened. "No," he said again, more gently. "That's not how it works." I nodded. We stood there for a while in the morning light, the 3 of us, or the 2.5 of us, counting me as a partial participant in whatever this was. And Cobre held Callum's gaze from across the pen with the steady, unblinking attention he'd developed over the weeks. And I tried to write down the shape of the moment and found my pen not moving. Some things you describe after, some things you can't describe at all. The 36th day was preparation. Callum spent it with quiet efficiency, doing what needed doing, and I helped where I could and kept out of the way where I couldn't. Tessie appeared in the late afternoon without announcement, and sat on the fence rail in the spot I'd been occupying for 5 weeks. She looked at Cobre for a long time. "Day after tomorrow," she said. "Yeah," Callum said. She picked at the fence rail. She developed the habit from watching him. "I don't want him to come back and get shot," she said. "I know. Is there a way to?" "Tessie," he said her name with gentleness, no impatience. "I don't know, that's honest." She absorbed this. "It doesn't seem fair," she said. "It's not about fair," he said. "It's about what is." She looked at Cobre. "I hate that," she said. "Yeah," Callum said. "Me too." She sat with that for a moment. Then she asked, with the abrupt pivot that was characteristic of her, "Do you think he knows you saved him?" Callum was quiet for long enough that I thought he might deflect it. "I think he knows I was there," he said finally. "That might be enough." Tessie considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to hard ideas. "I think he knows more than that," she said. "Maybe. I think he knows you're the reason he's alive." "Could be." "Then I think he should be able to say thank you." Callum looked at her. There was something in his face I hadn't seen, not emotion exactly, or not only emotion, but the recognition of a thought that has gotten in through a side door you didn't realize was open. "He can't," he said. "I know," Tessie said. "That's what I hate." She left before dinner. She didn't say goodbye to Cobre. I suspect that was intentional, that she'd said whatever needed saying in her own private version of this, in those morning visits on the fence rail, and that further ceremony was not something she was built for. I wrote, "Tessie Alderman is going to be a remarkable person. She already is. The remarkable part will just have more room to be visible when she's grown." The night before the release, I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. I've mentioned the nightmare, the chronic restlessness. But this was different. It was not the dark pressing in. It was a different quality of wakefulness, the kind that comes before things change irrevocably. I felt it a handful of times. Before my Uncle Amos died, before I left Ohio, before I stood at the fence on the first morning and watched a man hold a trembling hand toward a wounded lion. I got up and went to the pen. It was very cold, the deep cold of high-country October midnights, the stars enormous and remorseless above the ridge. I could hear Cobre before I saw him, that soft, resonant sound, the one I'd heard on the 14th night. He was doing it again, making sound into the dark. I sat on the fence rail for a long time, not writing, not even thinking in an organized way, just listening. After a while, I heard footsteps, and Callum came out of the bunkhouse in his coat, saw me, and came to stand at the fence. He didn't ask what I was doing there. I didn't ask what he was doing there. We listened to the lion for a while. "You'll go back to the survey work," Callum said. It wasn't a question. "After," I said, "after tomorrow." "Right. You'll stay on at the Alderman place." "Through winter," he said. "See after that." I nodded. The wind came down off the ridge and the fire in my camp had been out for hours, and I should have been cold. And I was cold. But it was the kind of cold you don't leave because the leaving feels like a concession to something that hasn't earned it. "I'm going to write about this," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Figured," he said. "Is that?" "Fine," he said, not indifferent, he meant it. "Things like this should be written," he paused. "Write it the way it happened." "Don't make it." "I won't. Bigger than it was." "It was exactly as big as it was," I said. "I won't make it bigger, I also won't make it smaller." He looked at me, and in the dark and the cold and the sound of the lion, I thought I saw something in his face that was close to gratitude, though it might have been relief, or just the expression of a man who has been largely alone with something large and strange for a long time, and is glad, finally, that someone else saw it too. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," I said. Neither of us moved for another 10 minutes. The morning of the 38th day was clear and still and very cold. I have written this moment in my journal more than any other in these pages. I've written it the morning after, and a month after, and a year after, and each time the words have been different, and each time something in the core of it has stayed the same, like a seed that produces different plants depending on the season but is always the same seed. We moved Cobre in the cart. He allowed this the way he'd allowed everything, with the still, amber-eyed patience that I'd come to understand was not passivity but a different kind of agency. The choice to allow, the choice to stay, the choice to come back to himself, slowly and painfully and without anyone being able to do it for him. The drive took 2 hours along tracks that climbed out of the valley and into the high country, through stands of aspen gone gold and rust, through the smell of pine and cold stone, the mountains opening up around us as we climbed until the Alderman Ranch was a cluster of brown buildings in the green-brown valley far below. Callum drove. I sat in the cart bed near the lion, my journal in my lap, pen in hand. I didn't write anything. I just sat with it, with the cold air and the mountain smell and the warm, enormous body of the lion lying in the blankets beside me, his eyes half open, his flank rising and falling. His bad leg was extended, the fur still slightly thin where it had grown back over the wound. He would carry the mark of it the rest of his life. We stopped at a clearing where the tree line broke and the high plateau opened ahead, rough, wide, full of the shadowed possibility of other lives, other tracks, other mornings. Elk country, deer country. The country of the lion as it had been before the trap, before the creek, before the 38 days. Callum got down from the cart and came to the back and opened the gate. He looked at Cobre for a moment. Cobre looked back. Then Callum stepped back, giving the lion the space of the open cart, the open clearing, the open country. Nothing happened for a moment. Cobre raised his head, his nostrils moved. The wind came down off the high plateau, carrying the cold smell of altitude and pine and everything above the tree line, and it touched the lion's face and his ears came forward, and his amber eyes went to the plateau with a focus I hadn't seen in them before. Not the focus of illness, not the focus of alertness, the focus of recognition. He gathered himself. The first step down from the cart was careful, the bad leg taking weight and the shoulder compensating in the slight, permanent roll Callum had predicted. He stood in the clearing, in the high country sun, and for a moment he was simply there, simply in the space between the man and the mountain, and the moment had a quality I have no word for. Then he walked into the tree line. He didn't run, he walked. He walked with the uneven, particular gait of an animal that has been remade, not into what it was before, because that's not the kind of thing that can be undone, but into something that carries the mark of what happened to it and moves forward anyway. He walked without looking back. In 20 seconds, the trees had taken him. The clearing was very quiet. I looked at Callum. He was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the place where Cobre had gone into the trees. His face was doing something that I find difficult to describe with precision. It was not grief, exactly, though grief was part of it. It was not relief. It was not the satisfaction of completion, because nothing about it looked complete. It looked like the after. Not the aftermath, which implies conclusion, but the after, the continuous tense. The ongoing fact of what you've done and what it cost and what it produced, and the question of what those three things add up to. He stood there for a full 5 minutes. I stood beside him and didn't speak and didn't write. At one point, halfway through the 5 minutes, he touched the side of his face with his fingertips. The gesture I'd seen him make before, always when something had moved him. He did it without being aware he was doing it, the way people do the things that are truly theirs. Then he turned, walked back to the cart, climbed up and picked up the reins. I got up beside him. We started back down the mountain. We drove for a mile before either of us spoke. "You think he'll find the high country?" I asked. "He'll find it," Callum said. "That's what he is." "Alderman's cattle." "Maybe," he said. He wasn't dismissing it. He wasn't resolving it. It was still there, the real geometry, the genuine risk, the fact that the story of Cobre and Callum had not answered all of the questions it raised and never would. The world was still the world. Cattle were still cattle. We drove through the gold-rust aspen and the cold pine smell, the valley spreading below us, the ranch appearing in increments as we descended. "I keep a log," I said. "Daily notes has been a habit since I was 19. "You said," Callum said. "I want to write this properly, not just notes." I paused. "Would you? Is there anything you want me to say?" "About how it was." He thought about this for a while. The horses picked their way down the track with the careful rhythm of animals that know where they're going. "Say it was the right thing," he said finally. "Not because it came out, because it was the right thing whether or not it came out." "You don't know if it came out yet," I pointed out. "Cobre could." "Doesn't matter," he said. "I mean it matters, but it doesn't change the thing." He kept his eyes on the track. "The doing of it was right, the rest is just weather." I turned that over in my mind. "The rest is just weather," I repeated. "Yeah." I wrote it in my journal, the journal balanced on my knee, the pen moving with the cart's sway, and read it back and thought it was the truest thing he'd said in 38 days, which was considerable. The last week at the Alderman Ranch had a particular texture. I did finish my survey work. I was a week overdue on the eastern boundary lines, and I spent 3 days in the high country completing the measurements and sketches and recordings that I'd been neglecting, and the work felt both familiar and strange. I was doing the thing I'd come to do, the thing I was paid to do, and it felt smaller than it had. Not diminished exactly, just more accurately sized. I'd been given a different scale to measure against, and it had recalibrated my sense of proportion. Callum went back to ranch work. He worked the fence lines, doctored a sick horse, helped Alderman's other hands with the fall cattle moving. He moved through those days the way he moved through everything, with the particular unhurried completeness that was native to him. We ate together most evenings, him and me and sometimes Alderman at the long table in the ranch kitchen, and we talked about practical things, the survey boundaries, the coming winter, a drought Alderman was concerned about, a fair in the spring. We did not talk about the lion. Not because it was forbidden or because we were avoiding it, but because it had become the kind of thing that doesn't require ongoing language. It had moved from the present tense into something more permanent, the way strong things do. Tessie ate with us twice and asked me careful, probing questions about the survey work with the thoroughness of a person who is genuinely interested and wants to understand, not just to fill silence. She did not ask about Cobre. She asked Callum on the second evening whether he was going to stay through spring. "Planning to," he said. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She moved on to other questions. On my last morning at the Alderman Ranch, she came to find me while I was packing the transit case onto my mule. She was carrying something, a folded piece of paper, which she held out to me with the slightly formal ceremony of an 11-year-old making a significant gesture. I unfolded it. It was a drawing, pencil, careful and competent in the way of children who take drawing seriously, of a lion. Large, walking. The rear legs slightly lower than the front, the particular role that Callum had predicted. The lion was facing away from the viewer into a space that was implied by the open paper, going somewhere the drawing couldn't show. I looked at Tessie. "For when you write it," she said. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the house with the businesslike stride of someone with other things to attend to. I put the drawing in my journal. It's still there, a different kind of mapping. I left on the 41st day, 3 days after the release, on a clear cold morning with the mountains enormous against a sky that was the particular blue of high country autumn. Callum walked me to the edge of the property. We stopped at the fence line, a fence line I had surveyed and measured and recorded weeks ago, doing the work I'd actually come to do. "Safe travel," he said. "Thank you," I said then, "for letting me stay." He looked at me. "I didn't let you do anything, you just stayed." "Yes," I said, "but you could have told me to go." He thought about this with the seriousness he gave all things. "Wouldn't have been right," he said. "You were supposed to see it." I didn't ask what he meant by that, supposed to in what framework, by whose reckoning. It was the kind of thing that would be ruined by the question. I just held it. "The drawing Tessie gave me," I said. "The lion is facing away, going somewhere." Callum looked at the mountains. "That's right," he said. She drew his leg the way it is now, the roll. "I know she showed me first." I looked at him. He'd known about the drawing. She'd cleared it with him, or shown it to him, in the particular way she had of consulting him on things she considered his to be consulted on. "She's going to be something," I said. "Already is," he said. Same words I'd written in my journal and never said aloud. I don't know whether that was coincidence or the way that true things, said about the same person by different observers, arrive at the same language. We said goodbye the way men of that time and place said goodbye. Briefly, with a handshake that held a moment longer than strictly necessary, with some acknowledgement in the grip that more had happened here than either of us was going to encapsulate in words, and with the understanding that some things don't close, they simply become the kind of thing you carry forward. I rode out through the aspens. I didn't look back. I thought about Cobre walking into the tree line, not looking back, and whether that was the same impulse or a different one, and concluded that maybe it didn't matter, that some kinds of going forward require you to look at what's ahead rather than what's behind. Not because what's behind isn't worth seeing, but because the seeing will keep and the going won't wait. I've written this account 4 times across different versions of this journal. The first version was written the week after I left the Alderman Ranch, in a boarding house in Alamitos, over 3 consecutive sleepless nights. It was too long and too raw and tried too hard to explain things I don't know how to explain. I burned it. The second version was 6 months later in the spring and was more controlled but less honest. I preserved it but have never shown it to anyone. The third version was 3 years later, when I learned, through the irregular, slow channels of territorial gossip, that a mountain lion with a distinctive rear-quarter roll had been sighted multiple times in the high country north of the Cimarron drainage, living, apparently, in the way that mountain lions live, invisibly, with competence, in the territory that was his by nature. That version I completed but found insufficient. Something was missing. This version, the 4th, I'm writing now. I'm writing it because I finally understand what was missing. Not information, not detail, not even the right language. What was missing was enough distance from the events to see them clearly. To see that this is not a story about a cowboy saving a mountain lion. It's a story about what it looks like when a person does the right thing for no reason that can be captured in a clean explanation, and what that costs, and what it produces, and why those things matter even especially when the outcome is uncertain. It is a story about Callum Greer's trembling hand held out in the gray morning light towards something that could have killed him. It is a story about a lion who didn't leave. It is a story about a girl with a drawing and a rancher who surprised himself, and 2 Apache men who arrived and affirmed what needed affirming, and a surveyor who couldn't figure out why he stayed and stayed anyway. It's a story about 38 days, and what 38 days can mean when they're spent in the company of a decision that was never going to be clean or safe or sensible. I don't know if Cobre is still alive. Mountain lions live 10, 12 years in the wild, less if they're injured. He would be old now if alive. He would be very old and moving with that role and hunting with the particular adaptations of an animal that has compensated for loss and is still, somehow, hunting. I think about that sometimes. I think about Callum, still at the Alderman Ranch as far as I know, doing the work that needs doing with the steady, unhurried attention he brings to all things. I think about whether he thinks about the lion, and I think the answer is yes, not obsessively, not with grief that has curdled into something unhealthy, but the way you think about the true things, the things that have changed the shape of you slightly and permanently, that you carry the way Cobre carries the roll in his gait. A mark of what happened and what it cost. And the going on regardless. The last thing I wrote in this journal, Journal 8, the one with the warped cover and the bloodstain on page 43, Cobre's blood from the second day, was not about the events themselves. It was a note to myself, written the night before I started writing this fourth version, an attempt to locate what the whole of it meant. It was not successful in the sense that I didn't arrive at a conclusion, but it was honest, so I'll put it here at the end. The question I started with, watching Callum hold his hand out in the gray morning, was, why is he doing this? 30-some years later, I understand that was the wrong question. The right question is not why. The right question is what does it mean that some people, when they find a living thing in the dark at the edge of death, move toward it? What does it tell us about the shape of a human being that this is possible, not universal, not common, but possible? I don't know what it means. I've lived with it for 30 years and I don't know. What I know is that it happened. I was there, I wrote it down.